You know, one might think that inheriting a house from an old family friend would turn into a quick money grab if you wanted to flip it. Well, that was kind of the idea. Our old friend was much closer to my parents and siblings than to me, so when I heard I was going to be bequeathed the house and property, I really couldn't believe it. Recently, things had been tough with this whole scare going on and a whole lot of businesses being shut down. Now that I was having problems, that is. You see, I am the rock of the family. Everyone leans on me when times get a little tough. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't just give my time and money away for any random reason. It is usually things like my nephew's summer camp, my niece's school supplies, and that is the sort of thing that they can count on from me. When the lawyer read it off, the will didn't say specifically, but I have a suspicion this is why they left me the old house. The lot itself had two houses, along with a barn and a few fields. The place was perfect as a small hobby farm, or if anybody wanted to do like more subsistence living or something along those lines. Being recently medically retired from the service, I figured maybe I should give a good once over before deciding what to do. It was important to consider all factors before making a decision, after all. When I arrived at the house, I was able to get just fine and with the keys they left behind. Entering this place was like going back in time, though. Many things were covered in sheets and immediately began to open the windows. My brother was with me and said you could see the dust burst out with each of the rooms as we were ventilating them. He was on the outside checking for obvious damage. Out of the two of us, he was far more versed in structural issues, which is why I brought him along. Once all the windows were open, we started pulling off the sheets from everything inside. It was amazing how well maintained everything was. It was all 1950s and 60s style items, but was like they were just covered yesterday. Dishes were stacked in the kitchen, and the dining room still had a table and chairs. Though these looked far older than the other furniture in the house, the living room furniture almost looked new, and even the radio worked. It did take a minute to get the music going, though someone had gone around the house and plugged all the outlets, so that was interesting, pulling all the safety plugs out. It was clear that whomever did this was fully prepared to return one day. I had no idea why they didn't. We went to the second floor and found that all the bedrooms were set up similar to the ground floor. All the beds were made and clothes were still in the closet. There were even rooms for children that were clearly set up for one for boys and one for girls. There were still toys around the rooms as though someone had just picked up their kids while they were playing and left the house. This started setting off my internal alarm. Something about this place was off, but I was having the hardest time placing it. I checked out the master bedroom as well and found that it was in the same condition as the children's room. Clothes in the closet, bed was made, dresser was full of items, and even a rack still had firearms on it. This really caught my attention because if there was a real emergency, then why wouldn't they have tried to defend themselves with weapons left? I asked my brothers about it, and they told me to stop trying to freak them out with the questions. I was checking the weapons out and found that not only were they very real, but they were high-end items. I'm not going to list them all off, but I will say that you can't find these sort of things easily. I didn't know if they were target shooters, but a few of them seemed for self-defense. Didn't have much time to admire them, though, as I could hear my little brother yelling from the downstairs. I went downstairs and saw him and my best friend trying to open the basement door. They found the correct key eventually, but the damn thing wouldn't open. I got a good look at the lock, didn't seem rusted or damaged at all. I asked for the key and checked to see if it was damaged at all. No, it was good, so I tried to open it myself. Oddly enough, the door unlocked without any issue. I tried to joke, but the hair on the back of my neck was sticking up as I clicked on the lights and headed downstairs. This lasted for about 2 steps before I started asking for a broom or something similar. Just like any basement, it was slightly damp and the perfect place for generations of spiders to make their home. It didn't take long to carve through them, but I know we would have to, at the very least, set off a couple of those bug bomb fogger thingies. When I got to the bottom of the stairs, I could see that it was a very large basement. It was broken into small rooms, but seemed to be a full basement. I grinned knowing that this was going to add value to the house lot. We looked around, and in the main areas, there wasn't much of anything except for a couple old items. Preserves of certain types, old washer, dryer, wood stove, water heater. Though there was where the normalcy ended. I could hear my friend struggling with one of the doors, so I went to see what the problem was. The door was old, and I mean really old. The style was that of pre-World War I, along with a handle and lock. I tried to find the right key on the keychain, but nothing looked that old. I reached out to check the lock, and it turned easily, which is strange because no one else could do that. When the click of the mechanism was heard and the door released its tight grip on the door frame, we all just stopped for a moment and looked at each other. We were all thinking the same thing, that there was something very off about this house. I opened the door, and a telltale smell hit me right away. My friend and I knew what that was, since he was a medic and deployed with me. We both knew what it was and could handle it. My brothers turned back and made a mess on the bathroom floor, and I immediately drew my pistol and flashlight to see into the darkness. My friend didn't carry any firearms, but he did draw his knife. We walked into with the same precision that we had been trained. I took a step inside and cleared the corner in front of me. When I turned, I was suddenly blinded by a light. It took only a moment to realize that it was my light shining back at me. I could see my friend's light moving around and as he searched for a light switch. He was unsuccessful. We did find a few small lanterns, which still had fluid in them, and so at least we could see. The room itself was small, only about 12 by 15 feet, or maybe 4 by 5 meters, if you're going by that. There was a single desk and a chair in the corner, and a mirror covered the entire wall on one side. We could see that this room was dug out and built by hand. Whoever did this was even worse with carpentry than I was. I was actually amazed that the entire thing wouldn't collapse over time. The smell of decomposition was due to the floor having a bunch of old damaged parts on the ground. There were fragments of old flesh and bone all over the floor. The walls were just plain and concrete, without any decoration, no outlets, no lights, minus those old lanterns. Really nothing but the mirror. The only part of that wall that wasn't the mirror was the border, made some sort out of wood and concrete. Though what really stood out was the intricate carvings on it. They seemed to go in a strange pattern all the way around the perimeter. It was almost like a language, but nothing I recognized. The smell was enough that my friend needed to get some fresh air. My brothers had already gone outside to finish emptying their stomachs. I could hear my friend's curse as he stepped up and stepped on some of the puke on his way out. As for me, my curiosity had peaked, and I still needed to finish checking the room. There was only one thing left to check, and that was the desk. It wasn't anything fancy. In fact, it looked handmade by someone with limited skill. There were only 2 drawers in it. There was a large drawer on the right side hand and one middle drawer as you would have for like a keyboard. On the right side drawer, there was something I wasn't expecting. There was a leather harness with a blade weapon strapped all over it. There were all sorts of things like throwing knives, several other daggers, and even a hatchet. I wanted to pull an Expendables and say, "That's my shit," but would be the only one to hear it, so it wouldn't be all that funny. I pulled out one of the daggers to get a closer look, and this thing was ancient. It was clearly handmade and still very sharp. The balance was good enough that it was heavy for the blade size, and there was more of that strange etching on the handle and the blade itself. Even the hatchet had a little bit of etching, but I didn't get too close of a look yet. I opened up the other drawer and found some old jewelry. It looked expensive, with what looked like silver and gold and with 7 colored stones in them. I was looking close when I realized how easy it was to see in that room without lights. This is when I noticed that the mirror had reflected so much light from my flashlight that it was having twice as much effect. Maybe that is why they put the mirror there. I didn't know, nor did I give a shit at this point. Went outside with the jewelry in hand, and I was watching my friend trying to wipe the soles of his shoes off. It wasn't until I was breathing the fresh air that I got a whiff of what was on my shoes, and I realized how truly unpleasant that smell was. I tried wiping it off using the lawn, and then I realized I had a set of old boots in the car. At least I could swap them out. I put the jewelry in the car and didn't think about them for the rest of the day. Since most of the house was in good condition, I just focused on cleaning up the basement while the others inventoried the rest of the house. I was using a shovel to scrape the basement floor when my big brother was clearing out the spider webs and the other brother built up the dirt. We tried to joke around as I filled up a bucket of old decomposition. With the amount of hairs that were mixed in, we were pretty sure that were some small rodents or other types of animals, though most of it must have turned into mush since I found only tiny bone fragments. I was almost done with the first bucket when I heard my friend scream, "Oh, sweet Jesus!" And then the sound we both, he and my little brother, running out the door. We ran upstairs to find them out in the lawn trying desperately to get fresh air in their lungs. Apparently, the refrigerator had not been emptied before they abandoned the house. You could smell it from the outside, and it was worse than the basement. Even I had trouble with that one, but we were there to clean an inventory, so that's what we did. After a day of cleaning on the way back to my apartment, I stopped to pick up something quick to eat, and then I realized that the books that were wrapped up in that leather harness were still in my car. I brought them in with me with dinner and opened up to the first page of each one just to see if they were dated. Thankfully they were, and this made finding out which one was the first one so I could read them in order very easy. As I sat down and chewed that fatty chemical swill they call a burger, I removed the jewelry from my pocket and began to examine it. There were those strange markings all around it I just couldn't decipher. I used every type of translation software I could find, but no joy. I even tried taking pictures of it on my phone, but I couldn't get the damn thing to focus enough for the computer to even begin to make sense of it. Finally, I said to hell with it, and pulled out my old Nikon KR5 35mm and finally got a decent picture. I used to do black and white photography as a side job, before everyone was too afraid to even shake hands. I did take a while to set up the equipment, but it took a little longer to get a clear picture I needed. The real fun happened when I scanned it into the computer and search led me into the deep web. I may be a computer idiot, but I'm not completely unaware of what can happen when you go down this road. As soon as I recognized where I was, I attempted to log off, but the inquiry about the symbols had people tracking my computer and not allowing me to leave. Since I'm not a total idiot, I pulled the cords of the power from the internet. Just to be safe, I pulled the battery out of my laptop, my tablet, as well as my phone. If you're wondering why I would go to dark like that, it's simply due to the fact that I do not mess around with people like this unless you have been taught how to deal with them. They can destroy your life or disappear, suicide you in a heartbeat. I'm just not stupid enough to get involved with them, and that's all. I didn't sleep all that well that night. The dogs must have felt my apprehension, as they would be pacing every time I woke up. Around 04, I decided I wasn't going to get any more sleep, so I got up to check things. Thankfully, everything was right where I left it. Yes, that includes the jewelry. Looking at it, I was glad that I had only taken a close-up with a single symbol. Though I had other pictures developed, they soon found their way into the fire. I wasn't sure what kind of swamp I might have stepped in, but I'm not taking any chances. Since I was up early, I got my friend and my brother's breakfast on the way to finish up with the house. Coming in early, I set the coffee and breakfast sandwiches on the table. Still holding on to the piece of jewelry, I stayed there until a little while before going back to my car and getting my gear. It wasn't much, just a light kit that includes magazine, first aid kit, and pistol, and a light vest. Walking downstairs, my heart began to beat hard. Something was off, and I didn't know what it was. so I better be ready. I reached the door to the mirror and slowly opened it. Turning on my flashlight, I went inside and looked around again. It was the same room, with the same mirror, and the same lack of everything else. I kept looking around for any reason for me to worry, but I didn't find any. I left once I heard my brothers walk in and calling for me. Reaching the top of the stairs, they gave me an odd look as I came up with my web gear on. A few odd comments, and me being dismissive later, they were sitting in the dining room table, eating out the overpriced coffee and sandwiches. I explained what happened. My brothers joked, but my friend, who had deployed with me, could see the seriousness on my face. Once we were done with breakfast, he and I went back down to the basement. We looked around the room again, but couldn't find anything. I showed him the jewelry piece, which, in all honesty, was about the same as the original pocket watch. Maybe I should say about triple the size of one of those things today. I couldn't see too well, so we figured we would light up the lanterns to get a better view. Why we didn't think of this before, I still don't know. We each lit a lantern, and when we pulled out the jewelry, we received a shock. As soon as the light from the lanterns hit the jewels, they began to glow, as did the symbols on the side. It wasn't blinding by any stretch, but it truly noticeable. We stood there, yelling profanities at what we were witnessing, when we noticed the symbols around the mirror began to glow as well. Each one of the glowing in a different way. Some started left to right, others went right to left, others from center all the way out. Some turned on like a light bulb, and even slowly started to glow until they were all bright. The yelling attracted my brothers as they came into the room, and they were immediately shocked at what they were seeing. I looked at the jewelry, expecting it to burn my hand, but it felt no different. That's when it hit me like a brick to the forehead. 7 different colored jewels were the same as the visual spectrum. I said as much as the mirror itself began to no longer reflect. The reflections of us faded, and in their place was an image of a dark cave-like structure. It was clearly carved out of the ground by hand, but had some obvious reinforcements put in place. There was something, but what we could see was in the far corner of the hallway. It made us all shiver in fear and hate. There was a woman chained with her arms over her head. She wasn't hanging off the ground, but it was clear that she had been kept there for a while. Around the area, there were others chained to the walls that were either empty or a single person that was long dead. There were other rooms on both sides that we could see into, though what we could see were bars, as in prison bars, and the front of most of the rooms, just barely the front, and see inside each one. We stood in awe at what we were seeing for a few moments, until I walked up to the mirror and tried to put my hand against it. My big brother tried to stop me, but I insisted. My hand didn't stop and went through and back without issue. It felt the same as entering water, but without getting wet. And that's when we suddenly smelled it. That same stench that permeated the room prior to us cleaning it. In truth, I would have rather done a wall-to-wall walk through the gas chamber than smelled that. Both of my brothers immediately puked, while my friend and I were able to maintain, if barely. We did back away, and with a little discussion, we decided to put out the lanterns. Thankfully, this had the desired effect, and the mirror went back to normal at the same speed that it changed. We were not going to get any cleaning done this day. After witnessing the mirror change into something that wasn't a mirror, we all bolted. We didn't clean up at all. We ended up running out of the room, slamming the door shut behind us. We went upstairs, and my brothers went directly outside screaming, "What the fuck was that? What the fuck was that? Oh, man!" at the top of their lungs. I was just confused as the rest of them and tried to tell them, but they were not exactly in a listening mood. I kept a death grip on the jewelry as I yelling continued. Thankfully, my friend calmed the situation down. When we went back in the house, we had to keep the door and windows open to keep the smell down. Just think of the most rancid fart you've ever experienced, and take that smell and rub it so far up your nose it ends up on your tongue, and you get a rough idea. Sitting at the table, we broke out the liquor and started to talk while we drank. The conversation was all about what we saw when the mirror changed. Here's what we came up with. First, we figured this was mystic energy and nothing else. Reason being is that our electronics, phones, to watches, nothing malfunctioned. Though it is true that energy is energy, basic physics will tell you that the waves and frequencies matter just as much. Second, is that whatever is showed to us had to be underground. The lack of fresh air and sunlight made that perfectly clear. This, compiled with the obviously masonry work, was used out of natural formations to their advantage. Now, my brother knows construction so much better than I do. He said that the supports were placed and sized in a way he believes that there is a very heavy structure above it. The third point was something we didn't want to talk about. The place was clearly a dungeon or prison of sorts. Bars for the doors and people chained to the walls made that pretty damn obvious. We noticed a female chained to the wall, and even though my brothers didn't have the training my friend and I do, it made them want to go in shooting something. This brought up the fourth point, the smell. We really didn't know what was in the air that made it so wretched to inhale. This could be a major concern. My friend was a medic after all and said that with that much methane, it would make an entire bit volatile, to say the least, if you decide to light anything off. I brought up the leather gear with the blades, and they wanted me to go get it. When I showed them, they all agreed that this was probably the reason for the blades. My little brother knows metals. Hell, he's the one that cast our bullets for hunting season. He mentioned how the metal and the blades were made of some sort of titanium alloy. I know what this means, just not how to make it work. Regardless, no medieval society had that type of metal. Since we had been drinking, though, the guys had to call their wives and tell them that we would be staying over. As a general rule, once you start drinking, keys stay in the pockets. We all know at least one person who didn't follow that rule and paid for it dearly. So, over a couple pizzas and some sodas and maybe a couple beers, need to mix some liquor in that soda somehow, too. We moved on to our fifth point. This was how do we traverse the area, or even can we go in without gasping and unknown factors with the air. The kicker is that you can pick up the sensors needed at the nearest hardware store. With all these factors discussed at great length, we made a plan to get what we needed to start testing the next day. I was mainly focused on the security aspects of it, although since firearms might cause an explosion, I looked into items of lethality but no ignition. Turns out the old meets the new on this one. I picked up 4 heavy-duty crossbows with a mix of solid shafts or bolts, and, of course, a couple hollow ones just for some distance. Oddly enough, it was the heads that cost the most. You see, I study history. I've studied military history for decades now, and I'm pretty well versed on what we may be encountering. This means we need everything from long-range, fresh mangling bolt to a solid armor-piercing bolt. This means a mix of heads as well. I was a little shy on body armor, but a tip of surplus store, and we had enough to cover ourselves. Even picked up a couple of riot shields for the heavy price. The hard part was finding swords and spears that weren't shitty reproductions. Thankfully, an old friend I knew had the ability to hook me up. He started asking a few questions I wasn't sure I should answer. You see, he's a really good man, but his health would not be an asset at all. It kind of hurt me to keep him in the dark, though. After leaving his shop, I had to refill my scuba tank, too. Yes, I dive, but I'm just a level 1 diver. Just increase the need for fresh air in a hurry, anyway. My brothers got the detector kits along with supplies to make a makeshift ballista. You know, the Romans called it a scorpion. Along with forging some solid metal bolts for it. We tested it outside and it punched straight through a concrete block which was holding the piece of plywood we were shooting at. My friend was a medic, so he focused mainly on that, though he had his own gear which made it a whole lot easier to get everybody covered. This whole process took about 2 days, and we were ready to try the mirror again. We all got ready behind the ballista, and it was primed and ready to fire. We used our flashlights to make sure the mirror didn't change before we were ready. We had our gear on, body armor, crossbows ready to shoot, with each have at least 6 knives in a piece. Our swords were ready, and we pulled out our respirators. The tank of air was good to go, with the regulator hooked up to the corner. With final checks on the sensors, we lit the lanterns and turned off the flashlights. I should mention that both my friend and I and our GoPros prior to lighting the lanterns. I even had on the table the mirrors started to light and the reflections faded to reveal the same god-awful scene. This time, there were far more personnel chained to the wall. A mixture of male and female bodies were chained up naked. Now, this wouldn't have shocked us, except for the fact that they were different colors. And I don't mean Caucasian, East Indian, Asian, African colors. No. There were few with almost pale white skin, others with black, as in coal black skin. A couple looked purple. There was even 3 or 4 that looked red or blue. It was surreal to see this. It only took a few moments before the air in the place filled our senses and we came right back to reality. We started taking air measurements, finding out things like the methane and hydrogen sulfide. The oxygen levels were very low, but not low enough to knock you out. I think of it kind of like high altitudes. We didn't have much time as my brothers that only had the respirators over their mouth and noses began to complain that it was burning their eyes. This is when my friend noticed something we hadn't before. Everyone chained up had their eyes closed. We thought it was weird, but we were the only ones there for measurements. We got what we needed and my friend and I blew out the lanterns. It took a while though for the mirror to go back. It might have been only about 10 to 15 seconds, but it was still kind of uncomfortable watching the image slowly fade and then the reflections of ourselves return. We took our measurements upstairs, checked them against charts that we'd printed out. The methane was high enough that it went in the danger zone for combustion, but the air itself was breathable. I wasn't taking any chances and said I would be wearing my M40 protective mask. My brothers nodded as they rubbed their eyes, I guess realizing how damaged the fumes were to their eyes. It was the next morning when we were ready to go and walked through the mirror. I could see the look of fear on my brothers' faces as they had never been on a mission before. Hell, one is a building contractor and the other's in IT. My friend seemed a bit hesitant to put his gear to be used during deployments. I offered for him to stay, but he responded, "I'm in far too deep now." I smiled and gave him a nod, and we went downstairs into that small room. It was decided that I would go first. Then my friend would follow. My brothers would pull security in case something went wrong. They both have wives and children, so just in case something went wrong, I wasn't going to risk it. I should note here that we figured out why the jewelry activates the way it does. You see, it needs pure light, not artificial light like from an LED. Flame or sun would be enough as long as it's direct line of sight to the mirror itself. Seems like a lot to go through, but you are looking at possibly crossing dimensions, so fuck it. We lit the lanterns and the jewels began to glow again as you imagine, and the image came into view. There seemed to be more this time, more humanoids chained up or laid out across the area. I started to relay final instructions to my brothers as I began to move forward. I freely admit I was shaking inside. I don't know if it was the adrenaline, fear, or maybe a mix of the two, but it was difficult to keep my voice steady as I stepped forward. My friend spoke up saying, "Okay, I'm right behind you." When he said this, someone must have heard him because I could hear yelling. One of the chained persons had opened their eyes and was calling for us. This made the others open their eyes and began to start yelling in a language I just did not understand. This must have got someone's attention because you could hear a booming voice echoing through the hall. This was enough to make me hesitate before even stepping through the mirror, and thank God for that. That is when, as I thought, this thing had walked through the camera shot, or at least it seemed that way, as something just suddenly appeared in front of us. It just appeared and walked away, yelling at one of the creatures being held. It turned to one of the females and addressed her in a way that made my blood boil. This thing was really large, looked rather fat too, with tusk-like teeth and almost hoof-like feet. Its nose was pushed flat as though someone had knocked it up 60 degrees. The eyes were narrow like it was trying to squint out the light. First it struck the female and then grabbed her ass. I should have seen what was coming next. My brothers both have children. One has a young daughter. Though I didn't see it, I'm sure it was the one who fired the ballista at that thing. The bolt hit the creature before it even had a chance to react. It flew and pierced the creature right in the ass. It actually went from left to right and skewered both cheeks. The creature yelled in pain and fell back, landing on its own injury, and then began to scream again from the sudden burst of pain. I knew this was bad, and I didn't have much choice. I moved forward and raised my crossbow. Stepping through the mirror, I fired and caught the creature in the neck. 3 more bolts came out shortly. 2 pierced the abdomen, and the 3rd hit the side of its head. The creature slumped, and that was the end of it. Quickly, I pulled the line, recocking the bow and setting another bolt. I proceeded to clear the room the way I've been trained. The only difference is that I only had a one-shot weapon. When I looked back to the mirror, I could see right through to my brothers on the other side. Coming out of my training, I began to look at what the mirror had done. Looking close, I could see that somehow it had breached the 4th dimension. The gate into this place was only as thick as the mirror itself. There was nothing behind it. I was having trouble holding my bladder as my mind struggled with the physics. My friend had come through and was yelling at me to keep my guard up. That is when we finally got a good look at who, or in this case what, was chained to the walls. No amount of fantasy reading or CGI watching could have prepared for what we saw. These humanoids, they're fucking elves, man. Not like Santa's helpers, but straight out of fantasy literature elves. The first one was the young female chained on the wall. I placed her age maybe 12 to 14. Her skin was almost solid black, and I don't mean the same way as you want to put it, but true, honest to God, solid black with like crystalline white hair. She looked like something had beat the shit out of her and was not even wearing anything. The only part that was truly, elf category was the telltale ears. She winced as I reached up to her chains to see if I could get them removed. That is when it hit me, to check the creature to just see if it had keys on it. Unfortunately, no joy. Frustrated, I stood up and kicked the corpse, cursing as he didn't have them on him. That is when a few of these elves started making noise, which I'm assuming was their language, and pointed at the wall near the front door. Sure enough, that is where the keys were hanging. I walked over to get them, and as I did, I could see my friend was trying to patch up those in the cells. I forgot to mention that many of those not chained to the wall had clear battle damage. Most of it was blunt force trauma or lacerations. There was a few puncture wounds as well, just not nearly as many. It was clear that they had been brought here by force. This made my blood boil as I grabbed the keys and began to unlock the chains. I only unlocked 3 before I handed the keys to one of them and ran to my friend. He was frantically trying to save another young female, maybe about 10 years old. I helped him with the CPR, and we did what we could. A minute later, he was suturing her up as she was barely holding on. Turning around, I could see that most of the elves had been freed, but many of the others required medical attention. I yelled for my big brother to come and help, and he hesitantly walked through to us. We guessed that they were thanking us in a way they were acting, but we couldn't understand a word they were saying. One of the females came crying to me and held up a young boy for me to see. I set him down and did what I could. A few minutes later, my friend grabbed me by the arm and gave me a look, the one that said, It's too late, man. The female started crying while being consoled by another. This truly made my blood boil with levels of hate I haven't felt in years. I used what I had to save as many as I could. With each casualty, I just saw I was hoping for something, anything, for me to empty my rage on. Well, I didn't have to wait too long. Another booming yell came from down the tunnel, and we had to maneuver to see around the mirror entrance. At least 3 or 4 of those monstrous things were coming. Each of them had a weapon of some sort in their hands, though only one carried an actual blade. This was bad enough, but there were even more prisoners who had not even seen from the mirror. I cursed as I drew up and fired, putting the bolt into the chest of one of them. It staggered for a moment and then just kept coming. Seeing this, I called out for my little brother to stay and only fire when he has a clear shot. He was yelling at me that he couldn't see what was going on, but honestly, I didn't care at that point. My friend was able to put a bolt into one of the monster's eyes. It slowed down its charge and came to a walk before dropping to the ground as the bolt had somehow made it to its brain. My big brother tried to do the same, but ended up just hitting the monster's open mouth. It dropped to its knees as blood began to pour from its throat, but it didn't stop it. The monsters kept getting closer, and I yelled out to my little brother to get ready. He must have been, because the moment one of those monsters passed by the mirrors, and it seemed to our perspective that the monster just walked through it, almost like a hologram. My brother fired the ballista. The solid metal bolt skewed the monster, sticking halfway out of its lower chest as the rest was still sticking out its back. This was enough to make the other pause. Good thing, too, because it gave us time to lock another bolt in our crossbows and fire. This time, 2 crossbows hit the monster's face while the third pierced its neck. It simply collapsed onto the ground. The last one got up in a rage as it spit out blood and charged. I didn't have time to lock another bolt before a massive arm launched my 200-pound ass into the wall. Instantly, I was praying that it was my plates that broke instead of my ribs. My brother and friend fired and backed away in time and were trying to get their arrows set. This thing threw its club-type weapon at them, forcing them to duck away. While this happened, one of the elves had come up to me, drew the sword. I forgot I even had that thing on me. He slashed at the monster's leg and must have severed the tendons because it instantly dropped to one knee and couldn't get up. It turned and saw the mirror entrance for the first time. It paused in confusion, and that must have been its last thought it had. Another solid metal bolt came flying through, catching it at the center of the chest and forcing the monster to flip back. The tip fell onto the floor, and the body it held up 2 feet off the ground. The weight of the monster caused it to slowly slide down the bolt until it was on the ground. With that, the fight was over. A couple of the elves helped me up. As I staggered to get my feet back under myself, my friend came over to see if I was all right, though we wouldn't know anything till I got to a hospital. At least I wasn't coughing blood, though, and I was sure I would end up pissing some. I called for status, but only my friend knew what to say. He helped me over to the mirror door, and I sat on one of the monsters that had been shot through the back. I tried to catch my breath, though that mask did not make it easy. As I sat, others were freed from their chains, and many came over, seeming to thank us. I didn't know why. They were still stuck in a dungeon underground somewhere. I did have time to get a much better look at all these different color elves. Though relatively human, they seemed to be much leaner than the average human. They seem to speak a similar language, but it's clear that they are not from the same tribes. Each of the colors seemed to rally together with their own for the most part, though they did converse with each other. Some of them had insignias on them, either burned or tattooed. With little observation, it was clear that there was more influential ones in the group, at least a little. With one of the purple ones, with all its decorations on it, said something loud to the other purple ones. She was quickly knocked to the floor. From her reaction and the look of shock as she caressed the side of her face, looking up at the others, I'm guessing she'd never been treated like that before. Guess no matter what world you're in, some things don't change. Friggin' elitist pains in the... Once I got my bearings, I told the others I was going to check the rest of the area. I yelled to my big brother to guard the mirror and my little brother to start getting water. Some of the elves looked like they were extremely dehydrated. I took a walk and found that the area was far bigger than we thought. There was enough room to imprison several hundred without even a single issue. Hell, if you stacked them in, you could get 1,000 in for sure. As I looked into some of the other cells, I was shocked to see that there were other species as well. Well, what was left of them anyway. There were a type of lizard people, a bunch of different types of animals ranging in sizes of a small dog to the size of an adolescent elephant. These bodies were not that old either, which is why I could tell what they were. But beyond that, they were well beyond the ability to save. The area ended up with a solid man-made wall. I had made note of the masonry work before heading back. When I got back, I could see my brother had gotten the water and had even gotten some old clothes for them. Though I may be of a conservative mindset, I'm still a guy and wouldn't have minded the ladies going without clothes for just a little while longer. My friend was able to go into the mirror and come back with more medical supplies. Things like large gauze, rolls of medical tape, and of course antibiotics. We were very limited on that last one, but I was sure glad to see that I put them to good use. An older male came up to me. My eyes leveled off at his red jawline as he spoke. I just stood there as he talked, but I still had no idea what he was saying. Judging from his movements, he was thanking me for his help, but I didn't know what else he said. I called over my brothers and friend, and we started discussing our next move. We didn't have enough to feed them. That was our problem. We had no layout of the land either. What the hell are we going to do now? We can't just leave them to be put back in chains. The moral question around for a while until the bunch of the elves started to yell. We looked and there was light approaching the prison door. Since the door was set up like a prison cell door, it was easy to see it coming. Soon, men in armor stood there yelling. They seemed to be yelling at the elves and not at us. It was understandable since those fat monster bodies were obstructing most of our view. I stood up and looked at one of them and said something to the man. And that man ran back from the direction they'd come. The one in charge must have noticed me because he stopped dead and stared. After dealing with so many monsters after coming to this world, it was surprising to see humans, especially when standing there, seeming to be some sort of honor guard, just staring at me. And I just stared right back. Now remember, I'm still in my gear with a full gas mask on. I walked slowly as my brother tried to grab my arm, telling me to stop. I walked up to the gate deliberately and slow. I did not hold my hands out to show that I'm unarmed. In fact, I held that crossbow tight in my hands. I waited around the bodies of monsters and walked right up to him, looked him in the eyes, and he was trying to keep his composure. This man was dressed in old plate armor. He looked a little bit like a conquistador since it was basically just a chest plate, though he wasn't wearing that weird helmet. Instead, it was similar to the old World War II pickle helmet, without the spike, though. His clothes were rugged, designed for hard work. This was true for his boots and gloves as well. His subordinates were dressed similarly and carried musket-type weapons that didn't look very clean. In fact, it looked like they had not changed their clothes in at least a week. The subordinates were clearly nervous at the sight of me, even though I didn't move an inch. One of them whispered to the one in charge and received an answer in a language, again, I just didn't understand, but it wasn't the same that the elves used. It wasn't Spanish, I can tell you that. I'm thinking about it a little, and it seemed almost like Hindu, of all things, though with an obviously slang to its words. The one in charge then walked up to the cell door and spoke. I had still no idea what he was saying. I am many things, but a linguist is not one of them. I spoke saying, I do not know your language, though I have a feeling you are the one who captured these folks. With that, I mentioned the elves and motioned to them over to my right and left. When I looked, they began to cower in fear. not just fear, but terror from looking at this man. This made my blood boil as I turned back. I must have moved in a way that was threatening because one of his subordinates leveled his weapon and fired. The ball hit me near the heart. The force was such a large object striking my plate set me off my feet and backwards down the short staircase I was standing on. Just 4 small steps, but enough to make the landing hurt a whole lot more than it had to. As I rolled to a stop at the bottom, I tried not to move as I did a quick mental assessment. It was clear that if my ribs weren't broken, they had taken far more damage than I wanted to think they did. I was in so much pain that I didn't even want to move, even though I could. Thinking for a few seconds, I could tell that the ball had not penetrated my vest. Thank God for small miracles. After a few moments, I could hear them laughing, the guards that is. Then a few seconds went by before I could hear my little brother call my name. This was enough to get me up out of my stupor. Sitting up, I looked at the 3 still standing in the doorway. The leader had some keys in his hands, perhaps about to open the door, when he looked up in shock and began to see me find my feet. His first subordinates began to reload, and I could see that the second one tried to ready his weapon. Painfully, I reached for the crossbow. A quick look revealed that it still had a bolt, so I leveled it off as the second subordinate tried to draw a bead on me, but I was just a little faster. The bolt pierced his eye, and he dropped his firearm. It hit the ground with the muzzle first and misfired. The firearm bounced up and hit the ceiling, coming back down in a cloud of white smoke. This was enough for the remaining 2 to nope the hell out of there. They ran up the staircase screaming, and we guessed for reinforcements. I fell back down on my ass as I tried to get some air back in my lungs. Thankfully, my friend got to me to check me out. Though his medical supplies were almost completely depleted, he could simply use what was left over of my IFAK, my personal individual first aid kit, to patch me up. My big brother showed up and was saying something to me. I began to freak out when I couldn't hear anything. That was the moment when I realized that concussion of the muzzleloader had rendered me temporarily deaf. I could hear a high tone as my friend was checking me for a concussion. Getting my wits back, I waved them both off and tried to get to my feet. Not so easy, but eventually some of the elves came over to help. We began to head back to the mirror when I noticed a few of the elves were slowly making their way to it. It was clear they thought this might be a way out. Trying to yell, I had to resort to hand signals to get them back away from the mirror. Had to be careful. For all we knew, our atmosphere would be toxic, and Lord knows what humans would do if they suddenly saw elves in our world. As I got my hearing back, my brother told me what he couldn't say before. We couldn't stay. There was no way out. No way to get the elves out without facing whatever was above us. I agreed, but to me and my friend, we just couldn't leave the mission incomplete. We had to figure something out. My little brother was freaking out, saying, if we don't leave, they could come back with a shitload of guns and take us all out. I love it when the obvious escapes you, don't you? My friend and I looked at each other and began to laugh. We had realized that our fears were not founded. Firearms would not cause an explosion, result that we had feared would happen from all the methane in the air. At this point, 2 black powder muskets had been fired with no resulting explosion. We talked for a bit and realized the first thing we needed was to get water, food, and clothing. I sent my brothers back through the mirror to get as many water jugs as they could find. Also, they would have to go back to my place and get the emergency food. For a group this large, it would only be good for 1-2 meals, maybe, though it was better than nothing. The water started coming through within a few minutes. My brother had the idea of grabbing an old wash tub and filling it with the hose from the outside. Luckily, it reached through the mirror. We found some non-glass cups, and the elves began to slam down as much water as they could. We tried to tell them to slow down, even tried hand signals to get them to not overfill with water too fast. They noticed, but didn't slow down until the first few started to vomit from drinking too much too fast. We were able to get them to slow down at that point, and everyone eventually received their fill. Unfortunately, sometimes it just isn't enough. A few more of the injured passed, and we tried to give them water. We tried IV fluids, but nothing. We moved them into their own cell. Guess we made it a makeshift morgue for now. With each one lost, my rage began to fuel even more. My friend had to calm me down every so often since he had seen that look in my eyes before. I took his word to heart, but I needed to stay angry. I work better that way. At this point, it was the only thing keeping me on my feet. That was when I saw something that defied science to the core. We gathered around one of the fallen, and there was a shimmer coming from their bodies as they reached out. I didn't know how to explain it, except between the body and the elves, their hands was like a distortion you get when looking at a hot road in the summer from a distance. It wasn't even the weirdest part. The dead child started coughing. They were alive, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Simultaneously, my friend and I said, "What the fuck?" as we watched. This wasn't until one of the adults fell over. We ran to him and checked his vitals. He was alive, but incredibly weak. Then two more fell over, and we started yelling at the remainder to stop, and thankfully they did. The elves picked up the three that had passed out and brought them over to the water. They kept trying to get them to drink, and other elves did the same strange magic thing with the other fallen elves. Couldn't watch for too long as we could hear armored footfalls in the stairway. This time, I didn't bother with a crossbow, and I pulled the rifle off my back. As I did, I was so happy that I spent the money on the sound suppressor for it. For those that don't know, a suppressor drowns the sound, doesn't make the bullet go slower, but it's definitely not like the movies. It's not that loud. Instead, it simply lowers the volume to the point where it doesn't cause permanent damage to your ears when you fire it. It was still really loud, especially in an enclosed area like this. From my location, I couldn't get a good shot at the door. As I moved around, I could see some of them trying to open the door as fast as possible. My guess was that it was a platoon-sized element, or maybe better, behind them just biting for the chance to charge in. As the door opened, I was able to see a couple to make it in. I raised my rifle and heard several shots, but not mine. My friend was the one with the worst PTSD I've ever seen. He had drawn his 9mm Beretta and dropped the first few where they stood. The elves ran for cover, holding their ears, as I got a good sight picture and began to take out the ones with the firearms first. Now, I know the state doesn't like it when you have a standard capacity third round magazine, but it allowed me to make sure none of them got in. Only after a few seconds of them trying to rush had they stopped trying to enter. The ones that had entered were either not moving or moaning in pain. My friend and I stood there, weapons up, staring at the door, and that's when we saw something we were not expecting to see. A piece of white cloth being waved at the end of a stick. It stuck out from the side of the door and waved for about 10 seconds. My friend and I looked at each other for a second and lowered our weapons, if only slightly. I noticed the pistol shaking in his hands as he kept a death grip on it. I walked over to him and put my hand on his shoulder. With a look and a hand motion, I got him back to the mirror. As he backed away, the original guard from earlier walked into view. He held that makeshift white flag in one hand, and the other was simply raised high. He stood at the doorway, and we looked at each other eye to eye for just a few moments. He then motioned to his men. I simply moved my head to the left, signaling, "Go get them." He said something to the ones behind him, and several came around the corner to help gather his people up who had fallen. I stood stoic as I could until one turned the corner with a firearm in hand. In a moment, I raised my rifle and shot the musket. At that range, you don't miss. Everyone stood up and raised their hands, at least until the guard leader saw that the younger one had brought a weapon. He began to yell at the younger man until he got close enough to clock him one. I could see, when he turned back to me, that he was trying to apologize. I simply lowered the muzzle of my weapon a little bit to let them collect their people. It was a good thing that I had a mask on, since I didn't want them to see me cracking up over one young guy being so frickin' dumb. When they got the last one out, the leader was locking the door, and I yelled through my mask, "Hey, He looked up and saw me holding the rifle with one arm I was pointing to the keys with the other. I motioned for him to drop them, but instead he tossed them inside. I really didn't care since I was just to slow them down if they ever tried to get them back in. When things finally calmed down, I turned back to the mirror. That's when I began to cough. It was difficult to hear me through the protective mask on, but they did see me. What I didn't tell them is I could taste blood. That wasn't good. Apparently, that shot to the torso did more damage than I thought. No time to rest now that I'm on the clock, though. Now, before all this latest excitement, the elves had shown that they could heal their wounded. Best guess was that's why they were in chains when they were first entered the room. From the looks of things, it took a lot out of them to do it, too, so he had to get them fed and fast. As it turns out, luck was on our side in this regard. My brother had come back with all my provisions. In case you were wondering, these are military rations. The majority of them are dehydrated and placed into number 10 cans. There were some MREs, meals rejected by the enemy, and a few civilian containers that were usually 3 months' supply of mostly pasta-type rations. I knew we would have to start a fire and boil water to make much of it edible and slightly palatable, though for this, I would have to reach into my pocket. Without much wood to burn, we had to shuttle some from the other side of the mirror. But now it was starting to get difficult to keep some of the elves from trying to rush the mirror thinking it was an escape. My little brother handled that with a simple air horn. With the sensitive hearing of the elves, one blast at close range was painful as far as I could tell as pepper spray in open eyes. As we served the food, thankfully my brother had grabbed a bunch of paper plates and bowls when he was getting the food. There seemed to be a definite hierarchy at work. Several of the more discernative elves tried to push their way to the front. Arguing ensued and a few small scuffles over who would eat first. That was until my friend racked his pistol, pulled the slide back, and resting it with a large metallic snap. That they all of a sudden paid attention to. Via hand signals, he was able to convey that the children would eat first. He was able to get them to line up, get them a plate or bowl, and get their chow in relatively short time. While the food cooked, my big brother noticed something strange. The fire was not burning up. He was noticing that the flames licked one side, showing that there was an air current, some sort of inside this dungeon. If we could figure out where it was coming from, we might have a way out. It isn't like we could just bring them back with us. Before you say, why not, consider that there would be no way to hide them from the general public for very long. And once the governments find out, well, you wouldn't find much more than a hastily made crime scene and some sort of official story over how they all just disappeared. Even worse, they would just Ruby Ridge or Waco us to make it happen. At this point, I was getting too tired to care. I sat down on the other side of the mirror and began to drift off. I was suddenly awakened by a hand shaking my shoulder. In that one motion, I grabbed the hand, twisted it, rolled over on top of the person, and drew my pistol. That is when I snapped back to reality and realized it was just my big brother. My friend was yelling at him, saying, "I told you not to do that! Kick his feet, not shake his shoulder, moron." I holstered my pistol, raised my brother up, and asked, "What the hell is going on?" Standing back up, my big brother said, "I did it! I found the way out!" After being woken up so abruptly, I struggled to get the sleep out of my eyes and got to my feet, and I could hear the happiness in my brother's voice as he kept talking. I finally got all the wits about me as I walked right past the mirror's opening and went around it so that we headed to the back of the cave. It didn't take long before I began to notice something. The air was getting colder with every step, and I could also feel a draft, even through all my gear. Looking around, I could see the elves wrapped up in blankets. I recognized them as the blankets from my house, even though one had actually come from the back of my car. I would have been angry, but I figured those kids huddling together under it needed a whole lot more than I did. It didn't take long to reach the back of the cave where the wall stood. I looked at my brother and said, "Okay, now what?" He grinned at me and asked me, "If this was a cave, then why is there a wall here?" At that point, I could have butt-stroked myself in the face for not realizing this sooner. Looking close, I could see where he had chipped away some of the mortar. This was where the source of the air had suddenly come from. He must have mentioned this to our other brother because he suddenly came running up with a sledgehammer, a pickaxe, and a couple of shovels. I slung my rifle across my back and picked up the sledgehammer and said, "All right, let's get to work." Now, it wasn't the easiest wall to take down, but not being one of modern cement allowed us to make rather large hole pretty quickly. The bricks were at least 8 inches wide and 12 inches long, and another 12 inches deep. There was no rebar or any reinforcement to it, so we punched through it and we could collapse large sections once we did. Looking through with my headlamp, I could see that the tunnel went for another 100 feet at least and then seemed to just stop. This would have made one wonder why they built the wall until you listened and could hear water running. The burst of air that came rushing in made even my new elven friends huddle even closer to the fire. They really didn't seem to like the cold at all. Though, to be fair, if I was wearing nothing but a blanket, I would have been cold too. My little brother went to go get more wood for the fire as we continued to clear the wall. We were almost done when the radio squawked at us. It was my friend calling. "Hey, you guys can lose the mast. With all the new air in this place, it's clear of methane." Even though my older brother took his mask off and took a deep breath, I was a little busy to take mine off at the time. That's actually when we heard the screaming. A scream of absolute horror echoed down the cave. My brother and I turned and ran back, dropping the tools as we ran around, and I pulled the rifle around off my back. It was only about 30 seconds before we could see the fire and the elves were near it, but backing away from something. We didn't figure what until we ran right through the mirror to the other side. That was when the screaming began again. My brother-in-law froze, looking around to see what it could be. I had my rifle up, scanning the room, and the elves kept making a bunch of noise, but we didn't see anything. I asked, "What the hell are they screaming about?" And my friend had no idea. He said he took off his respirator, and they all started screaming in some strange language. I turned, and sure enough, they were backing away from my big brother because he had his mask off too. I couldn't believe I didn't realize it sooner. We had been in full cover since we first arrived. With the strange look of our masks, or at least strange to them, they probably thought we were demons or something. We began motioning to them to calm down, which had little to almost no effect. Finally, I yelled just to get their attention. Really wish I knew their language at that point. I put my hand up and motioned to my brother to get back. I knelt down next to the fire and reached out my hands for them to take. They were clearly scared of us, though I had to figure out why. Best guess was that the humans of this world were far more violent than we thought. Eventually, a young one, I'm guessing about 8, walked up and took my hand. Then, on the other side, another young one, I'd say about 14 maybe, took my other hand. I brought their hands up to the sides of my head and guided their fingers to the release of my mask, then motioned for them to raise it. They pulled it off slowly and with a few gasps heard, but no one screaming and yelling. After taking the mask and placing it back into its pouch, I just stayed there until they all calmed down a bit more. That is when I heard a voice I didn't recognize. "I figured you would find your way down here." I jumped to my feet and looked around, my eyes adjusted enough that I could see a man standing in the doorway. He looked about 10, 15 years older than me, dressed in a mix of medieval and ancient Eastern clothing, holding just a torch. I grabbed my rifle and began to walk up to him. As I got closer, I could see a fairly well-trimmed beard on his lean face and those deep brown eyes. As I walked, I could feel myself putting my finger on the trigger, not knowing if this was an ambush or not. As I stopped about 10 feet from him, he said, "I was expecting your older brother." I responded, "He's here too." The man seemed to grin at this. We stood facing each other for a minute before he spoke again. You do remember me, don't you? It's okay. I mean, you were just a little kid back then. He took a few steps so that his face was right next to the bars. The last time I saw you, you were barely able to lift a bale of hay. At that moment, my memory slammed back into place. I remember the owner of the house having a teenage son and that my brother used to hang out with him. Those brown eyes, the strange lighter tint to them used to fascinate me as a kid, and they were a dead giveaway for this guy's. We exchanged pleasantries for about a minute before I asked him how he ended up like this. As it turns out, his father and grandmother were the ones who created the mirror and the jewelry that activated it. His father had found the cave and begun to pass through to perform quests and such. In return, he would bring back gold and jewelries to support the family. It was profitable before he started to build a reputation. The civilizations on this side of the mirror were about mid-Iron Age, at least when his father started, and had not yet figured out firearms. Because of that, the humans were pretty much mid-level as far as the food chain was concerned. His father decided to bring his flintlock musket to face off larger targets. That's where they got the design for their current level of firearms. After a few years, he had set up a base camp over the cave, and it wasn't long before he'd taken out the biggest monsters controlling the area. He said his father had pictures and showed him once. It was some sort of wyvern, with a wingspan of about 30 feet. Though it mainly ate fish, it was still fiercely territorial. Every attempt to kill it or force it out by the locals had resulted in massive casualties. His father was able to take it down with just a few placed shots. It was at this time that I asked him where his father was, and he responded, with my mother, sisters, and brother. I was confused as he continued. As it turns out, his father wanted to share the bounty with his family, so they packed everything up, only planning to go for about a year. Something happened after a few days. His father came back from the cave scared and out of breath. He never did tell anybody what happened, but he said they had to run. We didn't get very far, he said, lowering his voice. They must have seen the fire because they came at us in the night. We were dragged in front of their king, and he screamed at my father. My father stood firm and yelled back until the guards started drawing their weapons. Even as young as I was, I knew they were going to kill us. That is when my father said something that made the room relax. I had to take a breath at this revelation as he continued. Since then, we have been forced to create things for this king. You must have had a question mark on your face because he continued. Things like weapons, armor, sawmills, agricultural techniques, and even clothes. This was explaining so much, I thought. I asked, so why don't you just come back with us now? They got what they wanted. He laughed and responded with, you really think they would just let us go? Our knowledge of the other side is far more valuable than anything in this kingdom. Hell, when they found out that this was where they had entered from, they built a castle right on top of this place. Just like our old house, it is on the side of a mountain overlooking a field. He paused as though to adjust his thoughts. Our knowledge has allowed this kingdom to expand faster than the Romans could have even hoped for. So much so that the remainder of the nations are rallying together to overwhelm the army with just sheer numbers. My blood ran cold with this news. So then, why did you start taking the elf prisoners? Don't tell me that the slave trade here is as bad as you think. He lowered his head a bit and said, oh, I'm sure it's worse. However, these elves were not taken for sale. I just looked at him and said, what? He then continued, these elves have a healing ability. Perhaps you've even seen it. I nodded slightly as he continued. Something like that would be necessary for a long war. They could just take us down with simple attrition, but if we can refill our men... With that, my blood went from ice to fire. I said, I take it diplomacy didn't work. Laughing, he said, diplomacy? With creatures of this world? I could feel my hands tighten around my rifle as he continued. Do you really think elves would come to the aid of humans? Even the lizards folk that can speak don't want anything to do with the other races. And I suddenly remember the back of the cave. So that is why lizard men bodies are down here? Without hesitation, he responded. Probably. Though they may be capable warriors, their tactics really suck, and they have no magic to speak of. So for the king, they would be more of a hindrance than an ally. At this point, I looked at the elves, still huddled under their blankets. They looked up at me with fear, concern, and wonder in their eyes. Something I had seen before in my time, in my life, I wanted to forget. They didn't know what we were saying, but maybe they thought I was bartering for their release. I looked back up at the man. He had a strange smile on his face. I know that smile. That is the smile of a politician. That is the smile of someone who thinks they are getting over on you because they are in a certain position. He spoke again. I figure from the cold air you've broken through the wall. I wouldn't try it. By now they've sent sentries to spear anyone trying to escape. Besides, elves can't swim for shit. They prefer the forest, you know. This made me pause as I noticed that smile was getting more pronounced. You know, you can't just shoot your way out of here. You may not have bullets like you, but there are far too many corners for you to take where you wouldn't make it through. He paused. There is another option, looking him in the eyes. You could join us. What? I asked him. You could join us. Use that modern knowledge to help them improve, and they will pay very well. I'm sure the armor itself would be a national treasure. It took a direct hit, didn't it? I shuffled a little, remembering the pain, as he continued. The king would pay handsomely for anything you bring through that gate. I jumped in. You mean to get access to the gate? So what? He would kill me and try to bring back as many modern tech as possible? This seemed to actually make him pause. It doesn't work that way, he replied. That jewel can carry ties you to the gate. If you were to die, then the gate would shut permanently. He pulled the trinket from his pocket. As you can see, I carry one as well, but I can never get it to work. Sure enough, it looked like the exact same jewel I had in my pocket. If you help us, you could live a life in comfort, wealth, and women. You could even make those elves your slaves if you wanted. I looked back at the elves again. In a few moments, I turned back to the man, and he had a very mischievous look on his face. Give me some time to think about it. He smiled and said, Of course, and then walked away. Turning back, the elves were whispering to each other while still looking at me. I grabbed a piece of wood on the way by and put it on the fire. Continuing to walk back to the mirror, I passed my friend and my brothers. My friend asked, So, what are we going to do? I stopped briefly, deep in thought, and said, I need to make a call. With that, I went back into the mirror. What would happen next could decide the fate of two separate worlds. As I reached the magic portal itself, I realized that this will be the first time I've went across the mirror since I first crossed a few days ago. It gave me time to look in my wounds to make a call. Of course, making a call nowadays is a bit different than it used to be. After just a little bit of time, I was able to get everything I needed to continue. The look of diving equipment must have been very strange to the elves as I took it back into the cave. A few followed, I'm guessing out of sheer curiosity, and watched as I stripped down to get in my wetsuit. The air was cold, and the water was even worse. It wouldn't suit anyone if I got a case of hypothermia, so I made sure everything was ready. Once I checked my equipment, I handed off the end of my 550 paracord to my friend so that he could tie it to something solid. I would be drifting downstream and need a way back in case the current got a little strong. After climbing into the water, I got my fins on, and it was time to do some searching. Once under the water, I could get a good look. There was only about 20 feet or so from the inner dungeon wall to the outer edge. Slowly, I lowered myself, letting the current pull me. Since I am not certified as a cave diver, I went very slow, making sure that I did not catch my equipment on rocks or anything else on the way by. The water, though moving fairly fast, was remarkably clear. It was clear enough that it wasn't runoff from the supposed castle. I could even see a few fish in it, actually. Trying to stay as close to the center and as deep as possible, I could see myself start to come up to the daylight. It had to be around noon because the light shimmering in made everything sparkle in an almost blinding refraction. As my head finally passed out into the open, I suddenly felt a massive pain in my leg. As I recoiled in pain, I could feel it pull me upwards in the same area. Then there was a pain on the right side, and I could tell I'd just been slashed. As I thrashed around, I could see a bunch of spear tips coming down into the water. Those bastards must have been waiting here, just like that jerk said. The spear in my leg began to pull me up closer to the others. It must have been longer than the others that just kept jabbing at me, but never actually reaching down far enough. As it pulled, I kept getting closer and closer to the spears coming down at me. If I got any closer, the rest of the spears would perforate me and then drag me straight to the top. Suddenly, another long spear came down and hit my spare air tank. This one is kept up as a backup just in case my main tank fails. It's a small, separate tank on the front of my torso. The resulting explosion of air catapulted my torso to the bottom of the river. This made me hit the main tank on the river's floor. Thankfully, it didn't rupture. If it had, a really bad day would have been turned into probably my last day real fast. That is when I started going back up. The spear was still embedded into my calf muscle as I was being dragged to the surface. As I started to rise, I could see the other spears pulsating down into the water. There was no way to stop myself from being pulled into it at this range. I simply closed my eyes and waited. Didn't have to wait too long, though, as the 550 cord suddenly pulled me back upstream violently. As it did, the pain in my leg became excruciating as the spear twisted. I looked down, if down compared to where I was facing, and could see that those that had a grip on the spear had been pulled into the river. With that, my friend and his elf helpers pulled me back up out of the river. He immediately started working on my leg as I tried to get the scuba gear off. After a quick look, he said, "It's not going to come out easy." I grabbed onto the closest thing I could and waited. The elves I grabbed didn't know why I was suddenly holding onto them so tight, and the look of confusion until my friend moved the spear in position and broke it off with a good solid kick. I don't care who you are, no one could blame me for screaming at that. He could then pull the shaft out easily. He had to sew me up right then and there, and I'll admit a few tears came out. As he did, one of the elves picked up the end of the spear and showed it to the others. Not sure what they said, but they were clearly not happy. Eventually, I motioned to one of them in a way that said, "What?" Through hand motions, they showed that it's the metal used by either toxic to elves or some sort of tranquilizing effect in it. I couldn't quite tell which, though they seemed to hold it all right without it affecting them. At that point, I was more concerned with limping back to the mirror to get some of my antibiotics. The elves helped me back, and I had to calm my brothers down when they saw me bandaged on the way I was. I told them that I would have to try again some other time. This time, I wouldn't go back through the mirror. I stayed and got treated by the elves. They did some of that strange healing thing they did. It didn't look any different from what I saw before, but the feeling, that was weird. The pain, the excruciating pain, slowly disappeared as I could feel the nerve endings reattach themselves, the muscle reconnect, and the skin slowly mend. It only took a couple of minutes before I was back up on my feet, but I was still amazed at the feeling of the healing. While I was laying down from them to fix my leg, two of them looked up and moved higher on my body. I didn't know what they were doing until I could see the same energy radiating across my entire body. I didn't know what they did, but I suddenly felt better than I have in several years. When I stood up, my knees didn't hurt anymore, and my lost hearing was back. I thought that was until I started coughing hard. I could feel something moving around inside my lungs. I dropped on my knees and started to wheeze and cough painfully. I could hear air in all right, but it came out in violent and chunky. One of the elves got behind me and slapped me on the back several times. They must have loosened something because one solid cough, almost vomit, and a bunch of black congealed goop sprayed out of my mouth and ended up on the floor. I still had to get some of it out, but the majority of it came out in one go. By the way, it tasted several dozen levels of nasty. Rising back up, I could suddenly breathe better than I could remember. Taking a deep breath in, my head cleared, and I could finally assess what just happened. I looked at the pile of black goo as my friend checked me out. He looked at the goop as well and asked, "Are you think what I'm thinking?" I just answered him, "Fucking burn pits." An hour later, I'm getting ready to go upstream. This time, if I get in trouble, all I'd have to do is drift back to the starting point. As I go under, I know that the light is not nearly as strong. There's at least 100 feet of tunnel before I get to the exterior this time. As I climb along the bottom, it is clear that there will be no way to get the elves out this way unless I brought them one at a time. If this was going downstream, they could just hold their breath and swim hard, but upstream, with no places to stop to take a breath, not going to happen. I have to use my flashlight about halfway, at least I thought it was halfway to the end. Not being cave certified, I couldn't really estimate how dangerous what I was doing. It wasn't too long before I realized that I was out of the cave. Surfacing, I suddenly wished that I had my rifle with me. I looked around and tried to be as quiet as possible as I got a good look around, took off my fins, and began to take my surroundings in. Unlike the other side, there was no guards or persons of any kind. I did scare a couple small animals, but that was about it. I started looking at the flora and noticed how colorful it was. Even in the moonlight, I could see how colorful the creatures as the elves could hide in. Walking around the spur that kicked me out, about 90 degrees from the river, I could see that there was a fire. I snuck around to see what was going on. From behind the bushes, I could see the group that had tried to kill me with spears. While a few kept watch on the river, the rest of them ate and drank around the fire. Even saw one of them had either brought their wife or a prostitute to the party. It wouldn't be so bad if it wasn't for what else I saw. Now, I had to look up some of this, so bear with me. Though the ones in armor were mostly human, they had a few lizard men and a single one of those troll guys, like the ones we killed in the dungeon that first day. Though one of the females was human, the rest were halflings, lizard females, even elves, and even what seems like some sort of beastkin, however you say that. All of which were in some level of chains. That, I was guessing, was to remind them that they were servants. Instinctively, I reached for my dive knife, but I had to stop myself. Though I knew what was going to happen, I couldn't risk the operation. I couldn't think of a more difficult decision to make in that point in my life. Shaking, not only from the excitement, but from the cold, I went back to the cave opening and tied the end of the paracord to the tree near its base. Since it is green, it would be difficult to see and easy to make my way back upstream. Before I left, I pulled out my cell phone. I had it double wrapped in plastic bags and got a few pictures of the camp. I was so angry at what I saw that I didn't even want to talk when I got back. Though my little brother had the biggest shit-eating grin on his face. He confidently said, "I've got it." I looked confused and asked, "What do you got?" He showed a book and said, "I have a way to communicate with him now." He had a brilliant idea of getting a book that translated Elvish to English. At first I thought, no way is that possible. After a long discussion, he demonstrated that it worked. We figured that someone must have come across a long time ago and figured out their language. Guess the truth is stranger than fiction, after all. The symbols the elves used were not exactly right, in fact, only about 70% accurate. It was enough to get us started, though. Speaking of getting started, I have friends arriving. Time to get this show moving. My brothers take turns looking after the elves as my friend and I go to meet our longtime associates. Despite what you think, there wasn't much alcohol involved. For most of us, our heavy drinking days are long past. I did make sure that there was a bunch of food was delivered, though. As things began to settle down and the tone shifted, you see, I had sent out an emergency code to them. This made sure that they all knew to bring whatever materials, toys, tools they would need because one of us was in kind of deep. This isn't the first time that this has happened, but the group was much smaller from now on. Usually guys didn't show up due to family responsibilities or something like that. No one had an issue at this point. I sat them all down in the living room and told them that I'd gotten mixed up in some traffickers. Though I called them that is what they really are, slave traders. And I wanted to at least get one group free of them. They all looked a bit confused considering we were located in the country. They called it a flyover state for a reason, after all. I had to make sure they were ready for what was coming, so I asked my friend to retrieve a few of the refugees while I spilled it all out. I told them about the house, the mirror, the jewelry, all of it. I got a few eye rolls right off the bat, but eventually most of them started coming around. A few still didn't believe me until my friend walked in the room with an adult male, female, and young child elf. Two were red, and the third was a lighter purple or almost pink. Most of them stood up at the sight of the elves. With this motion, the young one clutched tightly to my friend's leg in fear of all the men in the room looking at her. I said, I have already come up with a plan, though if there are any ways that any of you can improve it, I'm all ears. A couple chuckles came out since the elves all had the long ears that humans do. I continued, though I do have to tell you that if you join me, it will probably turn into a one-way trip. I paused for a moment to make sure that phrase went over right. If you're in, meet me in the dining room. After briefing everybody on the mission I was putting out to free the elves from the dungeon, I walked into the dining room and hoped they would all join me. However, not everyone met me in the dining room. As was to be expected, a few of them have families at home waiting for them. Though as each individual trickled into the dining room, they each gave me a nod acknowledging that they were all in. I was waiting for my friend to join us, but all I could hear from him was a very loud conversation with his wife. They didn't have children, but that was still no reason to think he would just leave her and join me in this jailbreak. My brothers kept watching the elves as they continued to feed them with the new provisions we had purchased. It was still a bit surprising how they would eat very old sea rash, combat rations mainly on number 10 cans, without hesitation. When I mentioned that to the team, I could see it in their eyes. They knew how truly starved these elves must have been to eat something that nasty, and even asked for seconds. We spent a few hours going over the plan, adjusting it where we needed to, and then it was time to gear up. Time to break down the team. In total, there would be 6 of us going. There was me, of course, my 2 explosives experts, Charlie and Hotel. Yeah, I changed the names. They both bring a fair amount of grenades and other assorted devices. I never like carrying that stuff. It kind of makes me nervous. We have our heavy weapons man. We call him Char for break down his last name. And he was able to get his hands on a 240 Golf heavy machine gun. He may have had a lot of ammo, but I doubt it would slow him down much, given his size. Besides, I've never seen him a better shot with a full automatic ever. I mean, seriously, he keeps lighting the paper on fire with the tracers. That's how good he is. There was our marksman, Victor. He also brought seemed his favorite, which is the M14. Seems to like that better than more of the current firearms. Though I wasn't complaining with someone who could plug a 600-meter target. Finally, there was Doc, of course, my friend, the one that had been with me through this entire ordeal. He told us that his wife said, "If you can prove to me what you are saying is true, not only can you go, but I'll make you lunch." Guess we will have to make her eat her words or something like that. It was a long night of preparing gear and staging it near the river's edge. I was grateful for not being the only diver in the group. Victor was actually level 5 certified, so getting to the other side would be a lot easier. However, I did discover that the spear that ruptured my spare air tank had also punctured my buoyancy compensator. Looks like I'll have to go without it. Wouldn't matter much since I wouldn't be crawling along the bottom for most of it. Had to do the math though. Since I had performed a dive recently, I had to make sure I was going to not get the bends from diving too often. We all set up the gear and took a nap so we would be ready to go first thing. It would be just after dusk, their time, when we started, though now our group had expanded to 7. Doc's wife, once she realized that this was all real, was more than excited to go along with us. Turns out, she was into the fantasy and stuff like that. I warned her that it probably wasn't be as good as the books, but one look at the elves and she was all ready to go. She did get some strange looks from the elves as she brought her belongings through the mirror. She was heavy for what looked in their eyes, but in comparison to elves, she was absurdly fat. First part of the plan was to get upstream via the scuba gear. We would have to shuttle the guys since we couldn't get them all in a single group. Victor would help me bring everyone in pairs and shuttle them back to get the next one. The crawl wasn't much of an issue, with the exception of the extra weight, of course. When we reached the water on the far end, we came up weapons ready. We surveyed the area as we slowly made it to shore. Charlie and Hotel were the first ones we dropped off. They slowly made it up the sides and were taking up positions, with the dry bags, when Victor and I submerged again. Going back downstream was much faster due to the current, but having no buoyancy made things sporty on my part. The next 2 trips were fairly uneventful. We brought the rest of the guys, leaving Doc's wife behind because she just wasn't trained for this. We shuttled as much equipment as we could until our tanks ran dry. Due to the amount of time it took to get back and forth, dawn was beginning to approach as we made our way back downstream. The rest of the guys would have to lay low for the day until we got everything else ready. For the rest of the day, I had to get all the equipment, provisions, and gear ready to go downstream. It would be far too dangerous to move that much equipment in the daylight. I tried to get a few hours of sleep while that's going on, but my nerves were just going nuts. I was able to keep the comms with the guys on the outside, but that did little to calm my nerves. My brothers took turns coming to see me. It was quite possibly the last time they would see me, so... You see, the later stages of my plan had them go back to our original world and turn off the mirror. This would keep them from being taken later. I gave the jewelry that controls the gate to my older brother, and my will and testament to my little brother. This may seem a bit morbid to anyone reading this, but you need to understand one thing. For those of us that have been deployed to combat zones, this is actually quite normal. We prepared for every contingency because every contingency is possible. It is getting late in the day and the elves are beginning to come over to us. We tried to explain what's going on, at least the best we could given the circumstances. They know we are going to get them out and that we will get moving as soon as we get outside. I don't know if it's going to be a full moon, a new moon, or even if this place has a moon to begin with. Regardless, it is going to be a tough movement since we only have a few hours before they're going to be on us. I just received word that we're only an hour at most before sundown. I guess I'll get the last of my stuff on. I just realized something. That something is all the people and places I'm going to miss. When my nieces and nephews get older, perhaps they will use the mirror to see if we truly made a difference in this new world. I doubt they will believe any of it at first. Hell, the oldest is only 12. If this is going to be my last words, I leave before this damn mirror is closed, and then I can only say this. I'm doing what I know in my heart is the right thing. A man can't really do more than that. Oh, I just got the call and it's clear for the operation to begin. Goodbye. I still can't believe he wrote it all down. Guess he had more time to wait for the dark than I did. It's all here. Getting the house, finding the mirror, our recon, our fight with that big ogre looking bastard, all the way through the mission. Oh, I guess I should set things straight. This is Doc. Probably not who you were expecting, but things don't always go the way you plan. Best laid plans, or so they say. I suppose I should get to the point, the way things finished off these notes. You see, I was on the other side of the river when everything kicked off. We waited until they left their guard and went to sleep, which didn't take long since they decided to drink really early. Life's little bonuses, I guess. We struck in the first couple of tents and we were able to put the guards out with some chloroform I'm not going to say where I got it. Then we tied them up and gagged their asses so they wouldn't be able to yell for help. This worked until we got to the last tent. This is where we saw that big lizard or ogre or whatever it was helping them out. The chloroform didn't work on him at all. In fact, it seemed to have the same effect as an ammonia capsule of all things. It jumped up, scared the shit out of me, and it reached for its weapons, but Char put the 240 in its back. Guess it understood firearms because it just froze and let us tie it up. We were just staying as quiet as possible when we could hear the sounds of bells and people yelling. I just thought, uh-oh, we've been made. We ran out the tent and Charlie butt-stroked one of the last guards in the face. We looked in shock at what they were freaking on about. In the distance, we could see thousands of torches and lanterns coming our way. I guess I would have to clear something up. The river that goes to the cave comes out near the front gate of the castle. Not right under it, mind you, but enough where we were about to have much more company. It was about then that the radio opened up. It was Slim, the narrator of the previous portions. He asked what the hell was going on. But now the last of the guards had just noped on out, and we told Slim it would be safe for him to come out. He must have jumped right in because we saw him reach the opening in a quick second. He wasn't alone either. The supplies started coming up to the surface too, and the elf people were coming out as fast as we could pull them out of the water. We told Slim that he was coming, and he could just looked and he just started to curse real bad. It would have been funny if it wasn't for the fact that we only had about an hour before the forces coming would be close enough to see us. Most of us swore at ourselves that we didn't have our night vision, but it didn't matter that we didn't have nods anymore. We yanked the elves up as quick as we could to see the lights in the distance slowly making their way closer and closer. There sure were a lot of them. Then it hit me that my wife will be coming soon. Oh shit. I was hoping that because she didn't swim all that well, she would simply turn back. Well, that's when her head popped up and Charlie grabbed her and she yelled at him for being so rough. And then she could see the reason why he was. As the young ones started coming out, I began thinking we would make it out no problem. Well, when the arrows began shooting randomly launching our way, I'd say that was a problem. The one guard that got away must have told them what we were doing, and so they began to fire down. Hotel began to fire a few rounds up at the wall, and they must have gotten the message. The arrows stopped, at least for a while. That's when I saw Slim dragging out one of the guys he had tied up before. He turned to the guy so that he looked right at the approaching group, and then I saw the blood drain from the captive's face. Then Slim cut the ropes and his wrists and motioned towards the tents. I guess he got the message because he ran in and got his guys and ran them straight to the castle walls and started yelling. I guess the doors had already been locked and he was beginning to truly freak out. We began loading up so we could get out of there ASAP. That was when we got our first surprise. The arrows began again, and this time they must have been angry. Char, Slim, and me all got hit. Also, a few of the elves got clipped too. I had to limp over to one since one of those bastards had got me right in the upper calf. As I got there, Charlie and Hotel must have been pissed because they shot the top of the wall with HE rounds. High explosive. Don't know if it killed any of them, but I'm sure they had to change their pants. When I reached to the first casualties, they'd already started to do their healing magic thing they do. I looked up at Slim, and he was using a tree to snap the head off an arrow and went through his arm. He pulled out the other end, screaming, "God damn it, that's twice!" I don't care who you are, that was funny. With quick bandages, we picked up the wounded and got ready to move. I could see Char with his 240 in one hand and a young elf in the other. I tried to get some, but I had forgotten about my wounds. Of course, my wife was freaking out, didn't help matters. Just as we started to move, we could hear the guys on the wall starting yelling, and I figured that there was going to be another flurry of arrows. That is when we saw flaming arrows going out, this time far over our heads. Didn't know what they were shooting at, and really didn't want to find out. Then again, what choice do we have? Busting through the woods also came some sort of cavalry. It was a mix of big-ass spiders, wolves, men on horses, men who are horses, all sorts of things. They were not coming right at us, but maybe they could come our way due to the grenades going off. Don't know, don't care. Victor was the first one to start shooting as he yelled for everyone to get into the trees. That little piece of cover from the archers on the wall was better than nothing. We tried to get the elf people to stay in the middle, but they kept trying to run for it. Or worse, they kept trying to help and just get in the way. Hell, even my wife tried to pull my M9 out and shoot. She never could draw out of the holster, and that went all too well. She just ended up pulling me sideways. We began to hear sounds of muskets coming from the walls. I looked up to see flashes and the resulting cloud of smoke as several of these monster things went down. Those large musket balls not only hit the body, but they make a big-ass hole. But they would also rip off entire limbs, given the chance. One of the large spider legs was ripped clean off, making it crash into the ground and kick around in pain. One of the half-horse guys was blown in half by at least two of those musket golf ball-looking things. Oddly enough, the horse part of the body kept running another 15 feet before it just collapsed and fell over. The attackers didn't seem to have guns, but they did have other weapons. Once they got close, we could see them using bows, slingshots, and spears, all sorts of stuff. But that wasn't all. A few of the creatures would seem to be flinging parts of their bodies, almost like a porcupine can launch some of its quills, though these things seemed to be much better at controlling their shot. Strong, too, because they stuck into the stone walls. When the giant spiders got to the walls, they immediately began to climb up to cause all sorts of trouble. They would either shoot out some sort of webbing and drag someone over the wall, or spit some sort of acid goop on them, or just start ripping the guards to pieces once they got on top. The chaos forming must have given Charlie an idea. I could see him talking to Slim and Char, and then he pointed at me and my wife. They turned and told me that we had to go back. I told him I wasn't going to leave him. That was when Hotel kicked me in the leg slightly. The pain made me drop to one knee, and he said, "You're going." They got the scuba tanks and told us how to operate them. We would only have to stay under for about a minute as the current took us back. Slim's brothers would be on the other side waiting for us. He must have called them before he even got to their tanks. My wife would go first. No way I was leaving her behind with all the shit going on. She dove in as one of those creatures noticed us. Maybe it was the splash, but that didn't matter anymore. With an almost sickening yell, a bull-looking human-shaped thing came running at us. About 70 meters was the distance it had to run. 70 meters it had to get up to full speed. 70 meters to lower its head and ready for a strike. 70 meters to crush us like bugs. 70 meters for us to respond. 70 meters from him was about 5 seconds. 5 seconds was all the time he had to live as Char opened up with a heavy machine gun. This was a full automatic 7.62 millimeter, and at 70 meters, you don't miss. That thing fell right at Char's feet, and he looked up and smiles. 240, motherfucker, and that's no bull. He laughed while the rest of us just kind of rolled our eyes. That was when something came shooting out of the trees. It looked like a giant tentacle wrapped around Charlie and pulled him straight into the night. We heard screaming as another one came out and grabbed Slim. We could hear shooting from both of them, as well as them screaming and along something else. It wasn't just them either. Something was screaming in pain and anger, and we couldn't hear much more than shooting and yelling. Shots were coming out as we could see them both backing up as they were firing into the darkness. When we realized they could see us, they turned and ran back to us. Sin pulled out his radio and tossed it into pieces on the side. Whatever grabbed him, it squeezed him tight enough to break it. They were both covered in blood, and Charlie's arm hung limp to the side. It was clearly broken, so he was firing with his remaining hand. Slim turned to us and simply said, "Time to go." He looked up at Charlie. "Both of you." He grabbed Charlie and dragged him over to me in the tank. He told us to go, and he began to move the group and the elves out. Just as I was about to jump into the moving water, I saw a giant alligator-looking thing jump over the cover and chomp down on two of the elves. It started thrashing as the elves fought to get free. As I went below the water, I could see the guys pumping round after round, bullet after bullet into it. Blood sprayed from the elves' bodies as fresh bullets hit. That was the last thing I could see, except for flashes of light that faded as we go further down the river. They were right, and a pair of hands reached down and pulled us up. There was my wife and Slim's brothers pulling us out. They were asking us what happened as we could hear the sounds of gunfire fading away into the distance. We told them everything and had to stop his little brother from trying to jump in the river to help out. But then we couldn't hear the shooting except for the occasional volley. Those also became less and less. We decided to make our way back home. Before we left, Slim's big bro carved some words into the cave door. He carved so deep that nothing short of a cave-in would wipe them out. He left the words, "Are you ready to come home?" only about a foot away from the mirror's edge. His little brother was tearing up as the reality finally hit him. We went back through the mirror, through that damned portal, and blew out the lanterns. Honestly surprised that they had lasted this long, and watched the room slowly change back to the reflection we had been expecting a long time ago. At this point, both the brothers broke. They broke down right there in front of us as they grieved their own. Charlie and me got ourselves bandaged up, and I figured I would need a cover story for the hospital. My leg was still pretty bad, plus Charlie needed to get his arm in a cast. Before we left, we raised our glasses to our friends. When we came back to get the cars, Slim's little brother showed me what he had written. I had to chuckle a little at this manuscript, because the man hated doing paperwork. We checked that damn mirror every 6 months or so, hoping to find a message next to the question. Until then, all we can do is pass on the story. For now it ends here, but let's hope for the future. Goodbye for now. This is Doc, signing off. 10 August 2012.